Welcome, everybody, to the APS Colloquium. I want to thank Larry Esposito for standing in at very short notice. Our scheduled speaker, Néstor Espinosa from the Space Telescope Science Institute, who was going to talk about exoplanets with JWST, was unable to make it. He will be coming and giving the colloquium on the 28th of November later this semester. Larry Esposito is on our own APS faculty. He's been with us for a long time, since 1977. He's the principal investigator of the ultraviolet imaging spectrograph for the Cassini space mission to Saturn. As a member of the pioneer Saturn imaging team, he discovered the Saturn F ring, and he's been a participant in numerous US, Russian, and European space missions. He has been awarded the Harold C. Urey Prize from the American Astronomical Society, the NASA Medal for Exceptional Scientific Achievement, and the Richter Lecture Award from the American Association of Physics Teachers and the American Physical Society. Larry, please go ahead. Tell us about Saturn's rings. By the way, this is being recorded. In the question session, well, I'll try to bring up the microphone so that you can be part of the recording.
So welcome, everyone. Can you hear me? Excellent. So good to see you here. And I'm going to be talking about some aspects of Saturn's rings, which we've been investigating with a somewhat unusual method using the statistics of the ring occultations. So let me introduce you to this by saying the data that we're going to be talking about are all from the Cassini space mission, which was launched towards Saturn in 1997, arrived there in 2004, and for 13 years studied the Saturn system until in interest of protecting the Saturn system from any microbes that might be on the spacecraft, it was directed to plummet into the planet's atmosphere and burned up in a number of seconds in the year 2017. But luckily, during that period, we had gotten a huge amount of data, not to mention spectra and images, but also a technique that we had developed here at the University of Colorado for star occultations. So over 200 times, we watched individual stars from the spacecraft as they pass behind Saturn's rings. And with a specially designed experiment that measured the brightness of the star 1,000 times per second. And that gave us an unusual view of the rings of Saturn, one of the most distinctive phenomena in our solar system. And I hope I'm going to say some things about how this might relate to other flat disks in our universe, including protoplanetary disks, accretion disks, and galaxies. So if we look at Saturn's rings a little more closely, we can see that should have checked this one out. There we go. We can see a little more closely. Here are the rings from inside to out with their traditional names A, B, C, D. And this is a picture from the Cassini spacecraft, which might be what you could see if you looked at Saturn's rings on the space mission or got as close to them as we did. And at the same time, as I said, we also watch stars that pass behind the rings. And by measuring the opacity to the starlight, we get a similar measurement of the content of the rings. You can see that the picture looks very much like the transparency or the optical thickness of the ring. So we're able to see the thickest B ring, the A ring, which is not so dense, the C ring, and each of these is seen by the star with essentially the same structure that can be seen in the photograph. And the difference, though, is that the spatial resolution is about 100 times better with the star occultation because we measure the starlight every millisecond, which amounts to on the order of 10 meters in the rings. So if what I'm going to be talking about is how we're using these data to interpret structures in the rings. And of course, right to your eye, you can see that this tells us about the structure of the rings. The first moment, the transparency of the starlight, tells us what the average thickness of the rings is. And if the particles were all the same size, this would tell us basically the population of particles, low here, high here, and intermediate there. And so you can imagine that with the first data, we were looking at how transparent the rings were to make a measurement of the total amount of material there. But what I'm going to talk about is how we used higher order statistical moments to go beyond just the transparency and actually to improve our resolution by another factor of 10. And so let me talk, in this talk, I'm mostly going to talk about the variance of the starlight signal. So you can imagine the light from the star is random photons, they're Poisson distributed, that pass through the rings, and you might expect that the variance of that Poisson data, the counts that we get of starlight, that are our basic data set for the occultation, the counts would be Poisson distributed. And of course, that would be the case if all the photons were independent. But because there are structures in the rings that are larger, photons that are blocked by the same particle are not independent. And in fact, the bigger the particles, the more the difference from independent Poisson events there are. And by looking at the variance, that increases the variance of the data. What I like to say, you give a quiz in your class and you assume everybody does it independently. But if students are actually cheating and copying each other, then that will increase the variance of the, may not change the mean, but it will increase the variance of the test score. So in the same way, we're looking at this excess variance over the Poisson statistics that give us an estimate of the size. And there's a paper from about 30 years ago that says the excess variance is related to the area of the scatterers, the fractional area, pi r squared, over the area of the period where we're integrating the star counts. So I'm going to use this idea of the excess variance to look at structures that are not resolved either in the pictures or in the star occultations. And here's a close-up of one part of the A ring, and it's a camera photograph, and you can surely see that the rings are not homogeneous, and in fact, there are these varieties of structures, bands in the rings, which gradually get closer together as you move away from Saturn. And these are individual density waves in Saturn's rings, similar to the density waves that cause the spiral structure in galaxies, except in Saturn's rings, they're very tightly wrapped around, so that instead of the big, broad rings we see in a galaxy, we see multiple arms of the ring density wave here. And so you can see there's a whole bunch of density waves. This is a different phenomenon here. And each of them is excited by a satellite resonance. There's a moon going around Saturn whose orbital frequency is a small integer multiple rational fraction of the motion of the particle. So here we have, for example, in this wave here that's going out, we have the particle in the Saturn's rings goes around Saturn 6 times for every 5 orbits of the moon Janus that's outside the rings. So at that 6-to-5 resonance, there's a harmonic in the rings. The gravitational tug from the moon periodically strikes the ring particle at the same phase in its orbit, which causes a perturbation, and the rings are subject to waves that are started from those perturbations. So at the resonance itself, there's a resonant forcing, which drives a wave response, and the wave propagates away from the resonance, carrying angular momentum and energy. And you can probably imagine that you could see that the wave eventually damps out, and that some of these waves cross each other. There's a lot of interesting physics in here, but I want to draw your attention to this one particular density wave, which is one of the strongest in Saturn's rings. And you can see the crests of the wave, and those are places where the density is reaching a maximum. So it is a density wave. We have a periodic phenomenon, spiral wave propagating outward, and as the wave passes over a particular part of the ring, it's compressed. So there's a density wave, and the density wave, the density reaches a maximum in the crest. And then the wave diminishes, the particles spread apart, and the next crest of the wave comes, and they come back together again. And what you can see here is in between these crests, there's a lot of little structures here. Hopefully you can see these. These were called straw because of their straw-like appearance, and they appear between the crests of the density wave, the strongest density waves in Saturn's rings. And I'm going to use these statistics of the ring occultations to try to infer what's happening in between the waves, which would then have implications for the dynamics of the rings. So here's the closest view yet I've shown you of ring structure, and these are occultations, not from Cassini, but from a previous mission, Voyager, where we measure the distance from a particular resonance in the rings and the opacity of the rings, the optical depth through the photopolarimeter subsystem, which was an experiment on Voyager we built here at the University of Colorado. And what you can see is as the star passes behind the rings, you see a regular variation in the optical depth, which means an increase in the density. So that's why it's a density wave, and it's propagating outward. And I'm going to use the excess variance, the variance that we see in our data above Poisson statistics, which arises from structures in Saturn's rings. I'm going to try to use this statistic to see structural change within a density wave. So here are some data from one of those more than 200 occultations of part of Saturn's rings that covers the Janus 5 to 4 density wave. That is, it's excited at the resonance where a particle goes around 5 times every time Janus goes 4 times orbiting Saturn. And this particular star we were looking at is a bright UV star, Beta Centauri. And this was from the 105th orbit of Cassini, the ingress. So this is one of some 100. And what I've got plotted here is the black line is the density wave. You recognize this. So here's the distance away. And the wave increases in density, the wavelength shortens, and eventually the wave damps out. But overplotted on this, I've got these diamonds, which are the measurements of the excess variance. And you can see immediately that in between the wave crests, the variance is not symmetric. Of course, the variance depends on the optical depth, but what this means is the structure that's causing the excess variance, there's more of it here and less of it here. And this is separated by various, sorted into peaks and troughs and separated here. But you can see each of these successive passages of the wave over the rings creates an excess variance. That is, creates structure in the rings, and that structure is different from one opacity here and the same opacity somewhat later. So this radius here can be converted to a phase of the density wave forcing. And because the wave is propagating outward, that means the phase is going in the opposite direction. So the wave passes this location in the rings, and where we're looking here, the wave has just passed. So that's a very small phase. And then if that starts at 0, it goes up to 360 degrees at the next crest. And so the first thing about this that is doesn't require any interpretation is that there are structures in the rings that form and decay on orbital period. That's the separation in time between these crests is just one orbital period of a Saturn ring particle is about 10 hours here. So that means in 10 hours, we're getting structure occurring and then disappearing. And what could that structure be? Maybe it's the same thing we have in those photographs I showed you earlier, that straw-like structure. But we can use a model to calculate how much structural change there is, and we can also develop a dynamical model that would explain why the rings should be experiencing this structural change on this short period. So just to stop for a second, you know, Saturn's rings are at least hundreds of millions of years old and maybe billions of years old, and the particles have been going around Saturn for much of that time without accreting into satellites. And that's because, of course, they're inside the Roche limit. They're inside the limit where the differential tidal forces from the planet itself are stronger than the mutual gravitational attraction. And so that explains why there aren't why the rings haven't become moons, but in fact there are moons embedded among the rings that exist in sort of defiance of the Roche limit. Well, they're not actually defying it, but the Roche limit, Roche considered it, and Chandrasekhar's expansion of that is for a fluid particle. If the particles actually have strength, they can survive, the moons can survive inside the rings, just like us. We're inside the Roche limit. We're not being pulled apart, and that's because our bones and flesh are stronger than the tidal force from the Earth between our feet and our head. And in fact, so it is possible for things to stick together in the rings, but it's difficult for them to stick for a long time because the general forces are against that. On the other hand, if a particle becomes dense enough, it has a different Roche limit, which is closer to the planet. So if particles stick together and they clump up, they may have an existence that's transient. So inside the Roche limit, although naturally we would imagine everything is not going to form moons, moons can still form if they're small enough or transient. And so what we're looking at here is presumably a transient structure or sets of transient structures that form in the rings. These are known as self-gravity wakes. These transient structures are being driven by the forcing of the moon's gravity at this particular resonance, which creates a density wave to trigger this. So a model for that, so you're going to ask, well, why don't we just do a numerical simulation, see if that will work? And of course, we've definitely tried numerical simulations, but there's some real challenges with the numerical simulation. What are the boundary conditions? How big an area do you have to look at? How many particles? And in the particular physical case where we have to consider self-gravity and friction and the tidal force from Saturn and the forcing from a moon's resonance, there's not any known solution. That's more complications than can be solved in a numerical simulation. And I will show you some numerical simulations that don't include all the phenomena that were happening here, particularly the forcing. So, you know, the interesting stuff to me is how the moon triggers gravitational accretion during its passage of the density wave, and how that might apply to other flat disks. So instead of showing you a numerical simulation that fails to faithfully reproduce the rings, instead I'm going to talk about a simplified model here, which is based on an ecological analogy. So I'm going to ask, well, how could this really happen? How could we really explain what we see in the rings, which the rings have been around for hundreds of millions of years, but we see dynamic phenomena in them that are occurring on the time of ours? And the answer is to have a little analogy from biology, which is the predator-prey model. And you know the predator-prey model. We have here the lynx chasing the snowshoe hare. And what happens is the hare eats grass and multiplies, and therefore more lynx can live off of the hare, but they also multiply with a good food supply, but eventually there are too many lynx and they eat up more of the snowshoe rabbit, and the rabbit population drops, and following that the lynx starves, and because the lynx have starved, there's no possibility for more hares to grow, and we get this sort of behavior, which you can see on the bottom here, which is a regular variation in the prey, which is followed by a variation in the predator, out of phase, cyclic behavior. And in fact, if we were going to plot this up for a different model, similar nonlinear model for lions and gazelle, we see the prey reach a peak, followed by a peak in the lions, a crash in the predators, followed by a peak in the prey, etc. And if we were to plot this in a phase diagram of the predator versus the prey, we would see a cyclic behavior where starting at any one point, the prey increases, reaches a maximum, and then the predator increases, reaches a maximum, etc. And it's this cyclic behavior that we can use as an analogy for driving the forcing of accretion in Saturn's rings. And I just want to mention one thing. There also is a fixed point solution, which this system never achieves, which is in this center where there's a point, a fixed point where the number of gazelles and lions are at equilibrium. But the actual natural situation doesn't achieve that, and is driven, in the driven case, circulates around that fixed point. Okay. So what is my predator-prey model? It's like Goldreich's two-group approach. Does anybody know Goldreich's two-group approach? Anyway, he wrote a paper at NREV, and basically he's looking at the final stages of accretion in the planetary system. And he talks about runaway accretion of a disk of small bodies results in a tiny fraction of the bodies growing much larger than all the others. So those two are the prey and the predator here. The predator, the big bodies, live off of the small bodies. Dynamical, these big bodies dominate the viscous stirring. Dynamical friction by small bodies cooled the random velocities, the big ones. And random velocities of the small bodies were cooled by mutual collision. So he's talking about, oligarchs and disk particles at the end of the accretion. I'm talking about something that's more current. The small particles are the individual ring particles, and the large particles are these self-gravity wakes. They're aggregates, and the self-gravity wakes will grow, but as they do, they stir up the velocity, which is like a predator, and then the predator erodes the bodies to give a cyclic predator-prey relationship. So I don't want you to remember these equations, but then we have two equations for the mass of the aggregate and the dispersion velocity of the small particles. And so I've reduced, the reason for doing this is to reduce this from an n-body simulation involving hundreds of thousands of particles to a two-equation system where the big bodies grow and stir up the little bodies, which erode the big bodies. And the equations which we get are identical to the predator-prey equations. And in fact, we can solve these equations numerically now. And just like before, we get a behavior of the prey and the predators, but it's not quite as simple as what you saw for those linear models. But still the same thing is happening in this phase diagram. The trajectory is such that the mass increases, which triggers the dispersion velocity, which erodes the larger particles, which then go to zero velocity at the passage of the wave crest, and et cetera. And so we get a behavior here which is not sinusoidal, But the key part is the mass of the aggregates are formed is a periodic phenomenon which lags behind the forcing. So to compare this to Saturn's rings, we drive this system by the wave crests being so dense that all the relative velocities are damped, sort of like being in a traffic jam on the freeway. And then as the crest passes, the particles in the rings are diverging from each other and increasing their velocity, particularly stirred by the formation of aggregates at this moment when the velocity goes to zero in the crest of the wave. The aggregates are gravitationally unstable and they grow during that period. So the question would be, can this sort of phenomenon that we see here explain the observations that we have of Saturn's rings, particularly the star occultations excess variance? So in order to do that, I need to also have a more simplified model for the rings, not just the dynamics. And this is the famous granola bar model for self-gravity wakes, where I'm going to imagine that these wakes are actually rectangular parallelepipeds. And as I said, in Saturn's rings, the ring particles orbit in the Roche zone, the region surrounding the Roche limit, where accretion competes with disruption. And the ring particles form transient clumps, which are called self-gravity wakes, which are tilted and elongated with a typical radial scale of the Tumri wavelength. This is Aller Tumri, lambda t of about 60 meters. And we model these with the granola bar models, where each of the wakes is considered just a rectangular model, and the wakes are dominating the statistical moments of the Cassini UVIS star occultation in the areas where I'm interested in. So what does this look like? Well, it looks like granola bars. This is due to Josh Caldwell, former graduate of APS, PhD 1989. And I've compared his granola bar model. So these are the ring particles, which are sort of sticking together in clumps in granola bars. There are particles in between the clumps. They have a width W, a separation S, a height H, and all this other stuff is related to the geometry of the star occultation. And here's another CU graduate, Mark Lawrence, 2005 PhD, where he actually did a numerical simulation of the rings, and you can see the phenomena that he sees in his simulation are similar to these granola bars. There are aggregations that form transient aggregations that are elongated and tilted. So I'm going to use this particular model to analyze the occultation data. And so, of course, there's an equation for the normalized excess variance, which is what we plotted on the vertical ordinate before. And I'm going to use the granola bar model, this model, to compare to the data which I showed for one of Saturn's density waves in the A rings, the Janus 5 to 4 density wave. So I want to compare the occultation statistics to an unperturbed wake model, and it fails. And why does it fail? Because it predicts a symmetric behavior if there's no perturbation of the structures, there's no accretion or disaggregation caused by the waves. And we can then, however, still use a perturbed model to derive these parameters, the geometric parameters, the width of the wakes, their separation, and their height from the actual data. And I do that, and I convert the observed asymmetry in the variance. It naturally yields a variance in the wake growth. So W is going to vary over the passage of a wave. And I measure the amplitude variation and phase lag in a forcing cycle, and then compare that to this biological analog, to the predator-prey model. And the answer is the actual variations in the ring is even bigger than the predator-prey model. So it could mean that we need to update that predator-prey model, but it gives the same sort of predicted behavior, which is that the maximum in the structure lags behind the forcing. the passage of the density wave by about 40 degrees. And so here are those same data I showed you before, but now they've been sorted by phase. This is the excess variance compared to the variance that you'd expect from a Poisson distribution. And the data are these various colored points. They're the same points I showed you before, but they've all been plotted on top of each other for the periods between the various peaks. And you can see immediately that the variation in the excess variance is not symmetric. And in fact, if we have a symmetric model, that's shown with these green asterisks here. So a symmetric model would be no wake growth between the waves, and it's too low just after the wave passes, and it's too high before the next crest. After the wave passes, it's too low before the next crest. And so I put on here the actual fit to our data, where S plus W, the separation between the wakes and the wake width, equals 60 meters, which is what would be predicted for the density of the rings for the Toomey criterion for instability. That's the Toomey wavelength, which is the wavelength of the most unstable mode in a flat axisymmetric disk. So what can we say here? The phase is really not that well determined, but the phase is down here on the order of 60 degrees after the forcing. And the variation goes from 29 meters to 18.5. So if we're picking a uniform size, 20 meters would work pretty good. But the actual size is more than 50% bigger and something like 10% smaller. So the actual size of structures inferred from the variance they create in the occultation data shows that they, after the passage of a wave, grow to a size of about 30 meters and then are eroded to a size of about 18.5 meters. So this says two things. It says there really is growth in Saturn's rings that's excited on orbital timescales by the forcing from the density wave, and that a predator-prey model gives some estimate of how big that is. Okay, what does that tell us about structure and dynamics and origins of Saturn's rings? I'm going to try to extend that a little bit at the end. So, perturbed by passing density waves, self-gravity wakes, those are clumps in the rings, grow and erode on orbital timescales. So even though the rings have been around for maybe 4.5 billion years, they're actually aggregating and disaggregating on orbital timescales, on hour-long timescales. And we would like to say the rings of Saturn were evolving in front of our eyes. Now, because they are inside the Roche limit, we don't get runaway accretion like Goldreich is trying to get for the planets. So these things don't grow into moons. They're just temporary. They aggregate and they disaggregate. And the variance that we see, the excess variance, shows the width is between 18 and 29 meters. The Toomey wavelength is about 60 meters, and they're very flat. These structures have a height over width of about 0.1, and thus they're like 4 meters high. So, 4 meters, not even all the way to the ceiling here. So we're on a spacecraft that's 1 million miles away from Saturn, watching starlight flicker, and we can measure the sizes of structures in the rings to a scale of meters by using the statistics. And these results are consistent with a simple dynamical model of the rings, which is analogous to an ecological predator-prey interaction. And the collisions, or perhaps azimuthal instabilities of these wakes, may lead to the straw. All the stuff I've been talking to you about is still too small to be seen by the cameras on Cassini, but these structures that we're creating can grow to be big enough to be photogenic, and they are also seen in exactly the place where we're driving this forcing. And I didn't say much about gaps and ghosts, But the simulations also show not only do the rings aggregate in some places, but in some places there's an absence of ring particles. So there's a conservation of ring particles. If they clump together, you're going to leave particles, places where there are few particles, and they've been called gaps or ghosts or things like that. And I didn't get to talk about the next moment. So there's the mean, I talked about that, I showed that in the first slide. There's the variance, which I've been analyzing here. We've also analyzed the third central moment, the skewness. And the skewness indicates that not only are there these clumps, but there are a transparent mode in the rings, which has also been seen in some numerical simulations. So that's stuff we've learned about the structure of Saturn's rings, which tells us something about the dynamics, how the particles are interacting with each other, how they respond to forcing from periodic forcing from resonance, and the origin of the rings. Well, we have stuff in the rings that's getting together and coming apart. Maybe that's the result of a shattered moon early on, or perhaps it's the result of some larger bodies that are triggering, that remain in the rings, either aggregates or fragments that are triggering the aggregation. But here's where I want to end on my talk. I still have time left. I want to ask if similar resonant perturbations can trigger planet growth in a debris disk. So here's some sphere data of MWC 758. It's a young star with a protoplanetary disk. Data are from sphere. And I'm asking, are non-spiral structures, which you can see here, triggered by the passage of the density wave? And you can see they're exactly in the same location as the wave goes around. They're just, so if the wave is circulating like this, this is the point where the next crest is going to hit. So these are the places in this disk which have the possibility of growing for the longest period since the previous passage of a density wave arm. And so are these non-spiral structures triggered by the passing density wave? So in a protoplanetary disk, in a debris disk, we also have similar situations, lots of particles. Some of them can grow. Some growth is transient, sort of similar things to what Goldreich et al. Talked about in their 2006 paper. But potentially, the waves that are seen in these disks, whether they're just an instability of the disk or whether they're driven by a protoplanet, which would be a closer analogy to what we see in Saturn's rings, they can trigger further structure. So the density wave or density waves triggered by protoplanets can form structure in a protoplanetary disk. And here is my last slide, which you all recognize as a web image of M74. And you can see, once again, density wave in here. Same sort of wave that we're looking at in Saturn's rings, except not so tightly wound. And there's no doubt, as it passes through the medium, it's triggering growth of aggregates and potentially stars there. Okay, so that's my talk. And just to summarize, we were using the statistics of our experiment on Cassini to infer things on structures that are of the order of meters in size in Saturn's rings, 1,000 times better than the picture. And those give us implications about the dynamics and history of the rings, which might plausibly be practically applied to galaxies and debris disks. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Larry. Do we have questions, especially from our students?
Very interesting stuff. I had a question about whether we have any idea of what physical processes we might be missing and whether we could infer that from comparing the difference, the things that do not match the data, the things in the simulations that don't match the data.
So that's an excellent thought about using our data to look for things that aren't in our model. And the first thing I already mentioned is that the predator-prey model, the simple model I've been using of the dynamics, underpredicts the amplitude that we see in the rings. So I'm thinking if we're going to add something to that, it would be to add some gravitational instability or perhaps frictional forces, rolling forces in the rings that might help it accrete more and drive it to a higher amplitude. As far as the case for protoplanetary disks and galaxies, in Saturn's rings, we don't have any gas. So that's definitely, if you're going to apply this to a protoplanetary disk or to a galaxy, you would have to add in some gas phenomena, which have a different response to the forcing than what I've shown here.
Actually, I think David had his hand up.
So this is a really ignorant question. I'm sorry, but I was so intrigued by the title of your talk that I came.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah. So this fact that Saturn's rings have been going on for many billions of years, perhaps, and sort of the stability of this, even in your model, which is showing sort of the transients that are taking place. Does that speak to the probability of let's say an average protoplanet having rings? And
Yes.
Yeah. Can you tell us about that?
Right. So in our solar system, we have 8 planets, and the giant planets all have rings. Saturn's rings are the biggest of those, and they require a special event. Maybe Saturn was lucky; it hit the jackpot to have such big rings. And people argue, well, whether it was that 1 billion years ago or 100 million years ago, but the rings are basically stable and have been grinding down. And this was shown in a famous paper by James Clerk Maxwell. And so that so from the 19th century, so the stability of individual ring particles is established, but because they're running into each other, they're being ground down and they can't last forever. About exoplanets, well, of course, if you're going to find exoplanets, the exoplanets are quite likely to have rings and moons as well, and there's some slight evidence for that. No real discovery of a ring around an exoplanet yet, but there's some evidence that could be explained by ringed exoplanets.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, Larry. This is a biology question. You talked about the predator-prey relationships, but there's one little piece that you touched on but didn't really elaborate, and that is that the hares have to eat something themselves. And so there's a vegetation aspect to that whole cycle, because vegetation, of course, is seasonal. It has an oscillatory cycle of its own.
Right. So I'm not going to argue about the about exactly how well this analogy works, but in the case, the grass is not part of the predator-prey model. What actually happens is the population of the prey grows exponentially in the absence of predators, because presumably they have enough grass to eat. And so in the ring model, this is just gravitational accretion. The ring particles grow exponentially unless there's something that changes that. So that's the eating grass. I don't want to go back to the equation, but the eating grass term is the first term on the left-hand side of the right equation. And for rings, it causes an exponential growth, runaway growth. And for the hares, we assume in the model there's always enough grass to eat, so their population grows exponentially. So even though I don't have grass in it, the equations turn out to be the same. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for your talk, Larry. Clearly the Cassini and Voyager data sets are the best because they're the closest, but is there any continued Earth-based satellite occultation work that would actually still add any more information to the work you're doing? Because all you need is the timing, right? You need the sensitivity at the timescales of milliseconds. Can you?
Right. So this is a good idea. It's a good idea to keep looking at stars from Hubble and other platforms on the Earth, but the challenge is the diffraction limit. We still have the wave nature of light, and the scale then you can discover goes as the square root of the distance. So if you're 1,000,000 times farther away, like we are, then you have 1,000 times less resolution. So these particular structures in between density waves, which are on the order of kilometers, would be very difficult to resolve from the Earth because of the diffraction nature of light.
Hi. So I found the predator-prey model to be like a really, honestly cool and really intuitive way of describing that, and I never really thought of that having an analog with like planetary formation. And I guess my question is kind of rudimentary, just because I'm not super familiar with this field of work. But are there other like analogs, even just within the predator-prey model, that exist within planetary formation? Like other processes that could be described by that same model?
Right, thanks for that question. So when I first saw some of these phenomena in the rings, it was 2009, just after the Great Recession, and I had an economic model, boom and bust cycle, but the reviewer of our paper, Carl Murray, said, you know, if it's really so simple as that, you ought to be able to have an equation, some equations for that. And I checked the economic model, and they also use predator-prey analogies. So that's how I got to this. And there are many applications of predator-prey analogies to love affairs, to infection with viruses. You can really read the literature. It's a simple way to discuss these phase competing phenomena. The equation I get is similar to a driven pendulum. So there are lots of analogies. But another one about the planetary system is the one that Goldreich developed independently. I later discovered his two-group model, where he used a similar set of equations to describe the end stage of planetary accretion, where runaway growth is competing with collisions between the particles, between the protoplanets in that case, the planetary embryos. So I bet there are a number of others that you might consider where you have two coupled competing phenomena, and that the growth of one first excites and then reduces the growth of the other.
So this is a less than half-baked thought, but what do you make of binary asteroids, which are very common? But the asteroids themselves individually are rubble piles. So there's been, is there anything in there that speaks to this or vice versa?
So Goldreich has also worked on that problem as well. And there's several things that are related to this. The fact that you have rare events that can or directionally events that can lead to surprising outcomes. So you can have spiraling or colliding asteroids or Kuiper belt objects. And the idea that in some cases you might, in that constant cycling, you might achieve a breakout, a capture or a disruption. So I think the idea of cyclic processes that operate for millions of cycles can drive to unusual end states. Even though they're rare, the constant forcing can drive you to some persistent states. So I think there is a relationship, and for binary asteroids, that would mean that the various perturbations and crossings of asteroids could, with a very small probability, lead to a binary asteroid, but then the binary asteroid reaches a state of stability which preserves that very rare event for us to observe it later.
Maybe I could ask one more question.
Yeah.
I'd like to go back a few slides to the
Sure.
one where you showed a graph showing a disagreement between the predictions and the observations. Yes, that one. It seemed to me that there was a huge amount of scatter in the actual points, and you've averaged, but I don't know whether I would be persuaded that that's a genuine disagreement.
Right. So that's a good comment, Andrew. And a way to do this is, we could have binned the data or something like that. Or we can look at the means of the data compared to, and their standard deviations. But I agree, this is about the best we can do from our data, and perhaps we have to do, so I've shown you the worst case here. So if we picked red versus blue versus other diamonds, we could have some that look better. And we also could, instead of plotting all the data, we could plot the means and standard deviations in each of these colors. But the net result is whether this model fits or not, which I'd like to see. I like it to be a convincing case. It's still the case that the distribution of the data is asymmetric, is that it's not symmetric between the two sides. Okay, that's my contention. Go ahead.
Okay, I think that might be the.
There's one more
Any
question in
more-
the back,
oh,
which I would take.
So this was like more towards like the beginning of your presentation about how like Saturn's rings has like an A, B, and C section. I think you like already went over it, but I don't think I like got it fully. Like what causes like the B ring section to be like much more dense than like A and C?
The answer is unknown. But some people would say initial conditions. So if you were me, you would say each of the rings was made out of shattering a moon of Saturn. And the one that was shattered where the B ring is now was bigger and has lasted for a longer time. So, I talked about hitting the jackpot. So if you think it's a purely random event, then we're just lucky that we get the distribution that we see now. And we're incredibly lucky that Saturn has these massive rings while the other planets don't have anything like it.
Okay.
I'm just wondering whether anybody has ever tried self-organized criticality models on Saturn's rings.
No,
No?
it's an open field. I'm glad to share data with anybody who wants to try a model of it.
Going. Okay.
You mentioned the rings of the other planets. Are they in any way dense enough to do this kind of analysis if you had a great instrument?
So we do have occultations of all the rings from Voyager, but the Voyager experiment, even though we built it here, was not as good as this one we built for Cassini. So the data in some of the Uranian rings would be good enough to look for some of these phenomena. But as far as I know, nobody has done it yet.
Let's thank our speaker again. Thanks, Larry.